In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus promised that he would build his church even in the face of severe opposition. Perhaps the most incredible part of Jesus' kingdom-building plan is that he intended to use people to accomplish that goal. In fact, God's ordained method for reaching lost people is by believers sharing the gospel with non-believers. This is part of the Great Commission that Jesus tells his disciples in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. It's also part of Acts 1:8 Great Commission, where Jesus says that his disciples will be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. We share the gospel with people in hopes that they get saved. This is what the Apostle Paul was getting at in Romans chapter 10, verse 14, when he says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching?" Our hopes is that people get saved as we proclaim the gospel. But what if a person does not get saved? Can it be said that there is still any benefit from that evangelistic encounter, even when it does not lead to conversion? I think the Bible would say absolutely yes. Here's at least 12 reasons. Number one, evangelizing demystifies the act of evangelism. For many people, if you were to ask why they might not share the gospel with a friend, many people will say it's because they have fears about their lack of knowledge or what their friend might think of them. But if a person survives an evangelistic encounter intact, it usually lets them believe this is something I can do again, and it might actually motivate, produce future evangelistic encounters. If they survive this kind of encounter, it defangs evangelism. It makes us realize we can do this. Number two, evangelism cultivates dependence on God. Evangelism has a way of highlighting our own insufficiencies. In other words, oftentimes when we're sharing the gospel with a person, we realize that if God doesn't show up, if the Spirit doesn't move, we've got nothing. If you watch YouTube videos and see apologists and evangelists on the street or maybe in a debate kind of forum, sometimes it's easy for us to think, oh, as long as we have all the right answers, we can solve the obstacles, the problems that a person has with the Christian faith. We can get through to their thinking. But when we're engaging with a person one-on-one, it becomes evident that all of our best arguments might just be insufficient for the person who needs something more. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, 6 through 7, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth." Evangelism makes us say we need God's help to do this. Number three, evangelism sharpens our understanding and our articulation of the gospel. When you share the gospel with a person, it becomes pretty evident the places that you're describing that are sloppy or you don't have a clear way of articulating them. This is kind of following the same principle that the best way to learn something is to teach something. If you really understand the gospel well enough to share it, then you're prepared to do that multiple times. It actually causes a person to go to the Bible to ask questions. How can I help my non-believing neighbor see this truth? That leads to number four. Evangelism motivates our Bible reading. When a person opens the Bible for personal Bible study, we get great benefit from all the truths that God has to share. But after an evangelistic encounter where we didn't have a solid answer to a true inquiry, we are motivated to go mine for truth, to help that lost friend understand something that the gospel brings to bear. Number five, evangelism illuminates the truth of the Bible. The Bible warns us of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. It tells us that a fool has convinced himself that there is no God. It tells us that ignorant and unstable people will be confident in the assertions that they make, even in things they don't know what they're talking about. When the Bible tells us of the hard-heartedness of the sinful heart, we often reflect that on ourselves and remind ourselves, this is how we once were. But we don't always think about how that still plays out for those who are lost today. When we evangelize, we see those truths so clearly evident in the Bible come to light even in those conversations and gives us a greater trust in what the Bible teaches. Number six, evangelism helps us to realign our focus heavenward. So many of us in our interactions with the non-believers in our lives are kind of mired in the how's the weather kind of conversation. If we're not just talking about work, the quarterly assessment, we might just be talking about sports or vacation or things of this earth which are fine to talk about. But once we engage with a person at a spiritual level, we elevate the conversation and even that relationship to one that now talks about heavenly, eternal things. We begin not only focusing on what's temporal, but on what's eternal. This follows the kind of principle that Paul brings up for us in Colossians 3, verse 2, where he says, "Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." When we're talking with our friends about Jesus, truth, eternal things, we open a doorway to things far more meaningful than just what happens on this earth. Number 7, evangelism can sometimes help identify the spiritual gift of the individual doing the evangelism. You might not know that you're good at this. You might not even know that you've been gifted by God to have conversations with people. You might not see how the fruit of the Spirit are growing in your life until you have to engage with a non-believer with patience, with love, demonstrating joy in what the gospel is. I've met many people who were afraid to do evangelism until they knew and felt compelled by God that they should have a good conversation with a friend. And once they did, they were so overjoyed, they felt like they had found a new calling in their life, and they couldn't wait to share the gospel with everyone. It may identify a particular kind of special calling in the heart of an evangelist. Number 8, evangelism helps us to better understand non-believers. If you have a conversation with a person about their faith, you may first bring assumptions as to what they believe about truth. In fact, in Utah, we find all the time that we might assume what the people, the LDS people, believe about certain things until we engage in conversation to find out that there are variants of views, a diverse way that people approach particular topics. And we might not know that until we talk with them. This is one of the reasons that I highly encourage for pastors in Utah to have conversations with the people around, talk about the gospel, not only that they might be saved, but because it helps prepare the pastor to teach his people what the world actually thinks about truth. Number 9, evangelism helps develop compassion for the lost. When you spend time around non-believing people, sharing the gospel, asking them the most important questions that a person can ask, it is hard for our hearts to not be filled with love and compassion for the lost people. Jesus had a similar sentiment in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, when it says of him, "When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd." When we spend time with broken people talking about real things, sharing the gospel, it helps us learn to love them more. It makes us think of them as more than a mere neighbor or coworker or family member, but a soul that will spend eternity somewhere, and our hearts can be broken for them. Number 10, evangelism brings us back to our historical roots. This gives us a taste of Christian history and the great heroes of the faith throughout the last 2,000 years that have spread the gospel. When we share the gospel with non-believers, we engage in the same kind of thing as heroes of the faith like Hudson Taylor or William Carey, Jim Elliot, perhaps all the way back to the original disciples. I can't help but think that there's a way in which we can link arms traditionally with believers from all eras, over all different nations, in the same kind of experience as we try to share truth with a broken world. Number 11, evangelism demonstrates unity between believers. This is one of those great possibilities that can happen when we engage evangelistically with people. All of a sudden, you and a coworker 4 cubicles down, who also is a believer, who attends a different church at a different denomination, are united together around the water cooler as you're sharing the gospel with someone else. It's awesome to see a person who is hearing the gospel from 2 believers, from 2 different church backgrounds, 2 different Sunday morning places of worship, agreeing together on the core doctrines of the faith and helping that person come to an understanding of them. It helps us to major on the majors and even helps improve our attitudes concerning disagreement over less central doctrines. Number 12, perhaps most importantly, evangelism glorifies God. Just because God commanded it, when we engage in evangelism with a heart to see people won, to display our love for God, God is worshiped by that. Jesus tells us that we love him when we obey his commands. When we obey his command to share the gospel to the lost world, we are giving worship to God. Evangelism can be an act of worship. In other words, in that office place, God may not have been mentioned all day, maybe all month, maybe all year. But when you began engaging with another person, God's names was heard on the lips of the people there. The conversation talking about God was taking place in a place that it ought to, like it should go everywhere. Worship was going to God in a place that it would not have gone unless that conversation had been happening. When we glorify God, worship God through the act of evangelism, we also learn the lesson that sometimes, even when we don't immediately see conversion, it can teach us that obedience to God's command is in and of itself a reward for the believer. That was 12 benefits to evangelism, even when a person doesn't get immediately saved. Now, there are certainly far more benefits than just these, but it may be critical in a context as difficult as Utah for us to encourage our brothers and sisters in gospel witness even when we don't see the immediate fruits that we'd hope to see in evangelism.